Welcome back to Education Matters. Did you correctly answer 1896? Charles H. Mebane was elected in 1896 and served one term as North Carolina Superintendent of Public Instruction. He was the first school teacher to hold the position and later served as president of Catawba College and then superintendent of Catawba County Schools. Quite a career. Speaking of distinguished careers, our next two guests certainly fit that description and continue to make their mark in North Carolina. First, we have Howard Lee. Howard is the former chairman of the State Board of Education. He's also a former state senator, former cabinet member under Governor Hunt, and I want to point this one out too. Served as the mayor of Chapel Hill, not only the first African-American to serve as mayor of Chapel Hill, but also the first African-American to be elected in the South for a predominantly white city.
Correct.
Pretty cool stuff. Judge Willis Whichard. Judge Whichard is a former Associate Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. A little history with Bill Whichard, too. The only person in North Carolina history to serve on both of the state's appellate courts, Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, and serve in both houses of the state legislature. So you gentlemen should have a lot of great insights for us today, so I appreciate you coming on. Judge, I'm going to start with you. When a case like this, like HB 17, comes up on constitutional matters, I mean, how does the court evaluate and make decisions like that on constitutionality?
There's got to be a decision in the trial court to begin with, and in this case, that has not yet occurred. The trial court has only stayed matters until it can render a decision, but that then gets appealed. In the past, that might have gone directly to the Supreme Court. This legislature has said it's got to go to a full en banc hearing of the Court of Appeals before getting there. I will say I don't think it can constitutionally do that. I think the Supreme Court has inherent jurisdiction to take anything from the lower courts at any time it wishes, once there's been a lower court ruling. But my guess is the court will defer to that. They will not defy that. But once it gets there, the court has to look at the Constitution. If there are prior cases interpreting a given provision of the Constitution, it has to look at those. Most people don't know this, but North Carolina has a longer history of judicial review than the country does. Most people think judicial review begins with John Marshall's opinion in Marbury versus Madison in 1803. North Carolina had a 1787 case, Byard against Singleton, where the legislature had provided that when the state confiscated the property of people who were loyal to England during the Revolution, there were commissioner's sales, and all a purchaser at a commissioner's sale had to do was present their deed in court, and the court was to dismiss the case. They tried this against a woman named Elizabeth Byard, who had inherited property from her father, who had been a loyalist. And she said, but we have the state constitution that says there'll be a right to a trial by jury in all matters affecting property. So the court had to hold, ultimately. It tried not to go against the legislature, put the case off for a couple of months, try and get the lawyers to settle it. But ultimately, North Carolina, 16 years ahead of Marbury versus Madison, said the courts are the entity to determine whether the Constitution has been complied.
And that's why we have a Constitution and you have reviews. You do go back and say, well, what does it really say? And I do want to, I know that Bill Kobe is obviously a party to the lawsuit, so he wasn't going to be able to talk a lot about the case, and it's very early. You've looked at it. I mean, what is your initial take on their claims about constitutionality?
The Constitution clearly says the State Board of Education shall supervise and administer the free public school system. It says that the State Superintendent of Public Instruction is the secretary to the board and the chief administrative officer for the system. So it is pretty clear to me that the policy-making authority is given to the state board, and the legislature can't take that away and give it to the superintendent.
Well, we'll see what the courts have to say. Well, Howard, you didn't have a bill like this, but I'm guessing that turfs and who's in charge of what was something that you dealt with when you were state board chair too.
Well, no question. This tug of war among all parties, legislature, governor, state board, and superintendent has gone on for a number of years. And of course, there have been several attempts to try and clarify so that there will be a clear understanding both from the public perspective as well as from those in the servant roles perspective as to who really has the authority to do what. And I think that in spite of that, there have certainly been efforts made by all parties to try and make it work as much as possible. Governor Hunt, of course, was a key figure in the mid-'80s of trying to get this straightened out by asking for a constitutional amendment that would clarify this. That did not happen. There was a tug of war between several other parties going down the road. But when I was chair of the state board, it was very clear. Superintendent Ward, Mike Ward, was superintendent at that time. We balanced the power between the state board, understanding the state board was a policy operational and the superintendent was the administrator. Then, of course, although there was a court case that involved Superintendent June Atkinson, once she was in place as chairman of the state board, we were determined that there would be no conflict between the two of us. So for me, it's very clear, but at the same time, I've all along felt and still do, this matter needs to be dealt with in a respectful, responsible, and constructive way so everybody has a clear understanding as to who's playing what role.
Probably when it was sitting when you heard the news, sounds like Chairman Kobe was surprised. I guess you were surprised something like this would happen the way it did in December.
Well, I'm not going to say what I actually think as relates to the legislature, but obviously this was a surprise. I really saw no basis for going down this road whatsoever. Things are working well. Chairman Kobe has been a very good chair. And of course, Superintendent Atkinson was working well. And of course, we have a young superintendent coming in who will need the state board to both help guide him, but also give him support as he tries to develop relationships across the state. But I was shocked, and I really don't see the basis for what we're doing.
We're almost out of time. Last word, Judge Whichard, I guess your predictions. You said you think it's unconstitutional looking at it, but do you think that's where it's going to end up? Or,
I don't want to preempt the case. A former Supreme Court justice doesn't speak ex cathedra, but I will say I think the clear burden of persuasion is on the legislature. I think facially the Constitution says the state board shall supervise and administer the system. One of the choice points in the judicial process is
well, I understand. Unfortunately, we're out of time on that, Judge. I appreciate you being. We always run out of time. So thank you both for being. We'll have to have you back on for a full show. But after the break, we're going to have this week's Leadership Spotlight.